Good morning, good afternoon, and in some cases, good evening, because we have people joining us from all over the world. Hello, my name is Carlos Velasquez, and I'm with HMA Associates, and I want to welcome you and give you the official bienvenida for today's webinar, Unconscious Bias, Raising Health Equity, which is a part of the Getting to Zero 5-part series. We are so excited to have so many people joining us from all over the US and around the world, and we are very, very lucky. So I'm going to start today's session with a statement because we are recording today's session. Now, if for any reason you do not wish to have your image shared, we ask that your video be turned off the entire time. And in fact, we're asking people to have their video turned off until we get to a point where we may have some interaction. Dr. Bowers and Dr. Organista reserve that right to be as interactive as they wish. And we actually have a poll question, so we'll be capturing responses in the chat box. I also ask that you put your audio on mute when you are not speaking. And if you have any technical issues, please contact Adam Ungsen from HMA Associates in the private chat. And I've also posted his email and a cell number in case there really is an issue and there has to be a need to text Adam. So all of those options are available to you. And so we ask that you do respect the process and that you have your video off and your audio on mute until it's time to have that official interactive session. So I'm going to also read this section. By attending the remote webinar event, you will agree to the privacy policy of the county, as well as the associated remote hosting service. All information will be shared in relation to being able to provide a recording of this video if you'd like that. I know that Lucas is asking you for your email in case you want to get that link to the recording. And if for some reason we're not able to address all the questions that we have, we'll be capturing all the questions and providing answers through the team, and Dr. Organista and Bowers will also address any questions that you might have. So it's really important that if you want to receive that link to the recording, that you provide your email or contact information. All presenters of this continuing medical education activity has indicated that neither they nor their spouse or partner, legally recognized domestic partner, has any financial relationships with commercial interests related to the content of this activity. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Orisha Bowers. She is the Regional Director at the National Harm Reduction Coalition. She is a lifelong community advocate, educator, and leader. Dr. Bowers also is an ordained minister and combines her love for women's health, rights, and justice with research and interdisciplinary studies to continue to creatively transform the community for universal liberation. And it is my pleasure now to have Dr. Bowers unmute herself and to share her video as she is now taking full center stage. Thank you, Dr. Bowers.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for that wonderful introduction. Today's learning objectives are to first define implicit bias, and then define and tease apart personal biases and how they may affect our work. We also want to understand the intersections between implicit bias, race, and class, and then identify ways to recognize and combat implicit bias in practice and engage in a gradual process of self-awareness and institutional change. We can go to the next slide. So this is an opportunity for us to get you involved in the presentation. Please share one word that describes your feelings after you've experienced unconscious or implicit bias. And whether that can occur any place in your life, at any point in your life, but just tell us a little bit about what that feels like. Yes. I see some words coming through: hurt, defeated, demeaning, surprised, angry, yes. Feeling less than, yes. Exhausted, right. Invisible, angry, expected, confused, yeah, judged. Yes, all of these are feelings that come up when we have been treated in a certain way, where we go out to seek services, things that we feel, yes, this is, I need this, I deserve this, whatever the case may be. When we experience this behavior, it can bring up those kinds of feelings, right? And it affects the way in which we are able to navigate our lives, right? When you experience this on an ongoing basis, you know, it can impact the way that you see the world, right? Next slide. So I want to play a quick game with us. And this is called the implicit bias mind game. Right, so I'm going to attempt to read this, right? I couldn't believe that I could actually understand what I was reading. Every single word here is misspelled. Every one of us can read this without effort. We did not consciously decode the message. According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last be in the right place. All right, it can be a total mess and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Your unconscious mind is able to decode these words. All right, how many of you, and you can use your participant reactions key, but how many of you first saw this and thought, I'm not gonna be able to understand that? But as I was reading, you realized that you could read it too. Yeah, next slide. Something going on in our minds, right? So let's get into the defining part. So implicit bias is attitudes or beliefs, whether they be positive or negative, about other people. Okay, ideas, issues, or institutions that occur outside of our conscious awareness and control, which affect our opinions and behavior. So sometimes when we see images through the media or through social media, whether print media, what have you, sometimes people play tricks on us with the things that they show us because it plays into our implicit bias. So when we see certain images, it conjures things in our minds. It makes us think and behave in a certain way. And all of us have implicit bias, right? All of us are inundated with information and images and things of that nature, and we all respond and react according to our implicit bias. So it's important when we're talking about defining implicit bias that we recognize that everybody has this, so that we're not just having a us versus them or me versus them attitude, but recognizing that we all have implicit bias. And again, it can be positive or negative, but it's just something to be aware of, and maybe take the time sometimes to question why we think a certain way or why we're responding a certain way to situations or to people or to images that we see or situations. We can check that, right? We can inquire within ourselves about why we feel a certain way or why we think or act a certain way. Next slide. There's something going on in our mind. This is just an image. Next slide. When we talk, there's something going on in our mind, and how I like to parse this out is thinking about us versus them. In one group, you know, sometimes we're in the in group, sometimes we're in the out group, depending upon the situation that we're in. Generally, our thinking when we're in the in group is a group that one person belongs to, I identify with. So that can be things like I'm a Black person, their identities that we hold and accept about ourselves. So it could be I'm a Black person, I'm an LGBT person, I'm a member of clergy, I'm in the medical community, or all these different ways that we kind of categorize ourselves. This is an us way of thinking. A social group towards which a member feels respect and loyalty. So I respect the opinions of folks who are in the in group, the group that I feel a part of, or the group that resonates with me the most. Tend to think that members of the group are superior to the out group members. So if you are in a situation where you might be seeking medical care or some type of treatment in the community, you are the person who's you're the person who's providing services. Let me say that. If I'm the person who's providing services and my patients are considered in the out group, that's the them group, I may have an implicit bias, right? I may feel like my thoughts or what I think they should do for their lives is more important or more superior or more correct or more respectable than the individual that I'm providing care to, right? On the flip side, if I trust my clients or I trust my patients or I trust my participants, then I consider them part of the in group, right? They're a partner in their healthcare. They're a partner in their services. They're a partner with me in making sure that they achieve the goals that they want for their lives. So I'm just sharing just some very quick examples to kind of help us test our thinking to figure out those moments where we might be having us versus them thinking. The out group is a group that one does not belong to or identify with. And in this days of social unrest, we know that there may be folks who are in one racial ethnic group that feels that they're not a part of another racial ethnic group. And so their cares, concerns don't matter, right? Whereas there are other folks who, we're all part of the same human race. And so your cares and my cares are all important. So it's this us versus them thinking is a great place to start in terms of how to raise our consciousness and awareness about where we may have implicit bias, where this may come up for us in the work that we do or the way that we live our lives or how we see other people and encounter with other people. Out group, a social group towards which a person feels a sense of competition or opposition. So we can see this, sometimes with young people, there's all kinds of ways in which young folks can become competitive with each other, right? It can be hair, it can be clothing, it can be, the seniors versus the freshmen versus the sophomores. Like all these types of things are very simple examples, but these are still ways in which we can see us versus them. And this out group tends to be treated or thought of as inferior and not as good as the in-group members. And again, in this time of social unrest, we see a lot of that kind of thinking going on with people. And it comes up in the way we talk about situations and how we try to solve social problems. And it's unfortunate. It brings up all those feelings that folks put in the chat box earlier. And it impacts the way that we go about our daily lives. Next slide. So I challenge us to think about the 10 people in our lives that are most close to us, our trusted 10. These are 10 people who they're our go-to folks. They are people that we talk to on a regular basis every day. Think about the people who the science is that we have 10 people in our life that are trusted 10. And those 10 folks are people who are very highly esteemed in our lives. They're people that we spend the most of our time with. I want you to take about 2 minutes to think about your trusted 10. And if you're able, if you have paper and pencil, you'll see these columns across the top. You can just put their initials, jot down their initials, their gender, their race, their age, orientation, education, disability. These are all demographics that you may or may not know about the individual. But the exercise itself is to help you to, again, raise your awareness about your own implicit bias, right? So what are the things that apply to the in group related to your trusted team? And what are things that are related to the out group of your trusted team? Remember, the in group is folks who you have things in common with. You feel like you're a part of the group, they're a part of, y'all are a part of the same group. And your out group is the them. Oh, I'm different from that group. This is all about us. We're not sharing anything here. This is just an exercise for us to just think about the 10 people that we spend the most time with and where there are convergence and divergence in our trusted 10. And I am timing y'all, so I really do need like 2 minutes. Now that you've kind of jotted that down for yourself, just think about, we're not going to share, but think about places where you may be part of the in-group, your 10 may be part of the in-group, and how you may challenge yourself to create relationships with folks who may be part of the out-group, and vice versa. If all your folks are part of the out-group, maybe challenge yourself to cross that line and create relationships with folks who may be part of the in-group. To sort of dismantle the us versus them thinking. Next slide. Cognitive dissonance, the unpleasant emotion that results from believing 2 contradictory things at the same time. So in the chat, if you have an example of a moment or a thought or a feeling where, experience where you have had contradictory beliefs, you have 2 different things going on at the same time. And for an example, I will give my example for you all. So I have a very, very negative feeling about weight gain, right? I know what to do to control my weight. However, I continue to have sweets all times of day and night. And I feel really bad sometimes. I know better than this, but I still do it anyway. That is an example of cognitive dissonance. But I wonder if there are other examples that folks in the audience have to share, because cognitive dissonance becomes a key concept to remember in this conversation around unconscious bias. Virtual learning. Yes, the chat, understanding the importance of education, but despising virtual learning. I do understand that. Others, feel free to share. Remember, these don't have to be related. Although this conversation is about health, healthcare, it's important for us to recognize and trace these concepts in other places in our lives, because it may not resonate with us when we're thinking about healthcare, right? But we may have very clear examples of these things coming out in other places in our lives. So it's okay to think outside of the healthcare setting. Let's keep going. Next slide. So the first step in defeating our hidden biases is to be honest with ourselves about the blind spots we have. So it's okay for us to acknowledge and be aware of things and places where it may be a mismatch in our beliefs. It's okay for us to recognize places where we may have a preference towards certain things and we don't have a preference for other things. Like, it's okay for us to recognize those things. It's a part of our human makeup. The issue is making no effort to improve, right? In the places where there's negative bias, negative unconscious bias. We have to be aware of it, and we have to take steps to change those attitudes. Next slide. So implicit bias generally results in a preference for dominant group members and creates privilege for people in those groups. So let's think about some groups in our society who experience special privileges, advancements, name some of those groups, some privileged groups. I'll go first. Men. men are veterans. Yes. Cisgender folks, yes. What about people who are able-bodied? Educated folks. CEOs. Citizens, U.S. citizens, wealthy people. Housed people, very good example. The police, yes. Other examples. Doctors, yes. Yes. I want to break some of these out because I'm sure that there are other folks who are on the call who may be looking at some of the responses thinking, I'm one of those people. And age. I'm one of those people. I fit into that group. I'm in the N group for educated people. And no, I'm not. I don't experience privilege. I think that it's important here to always think about we all experience privilege in the same ways in which we at times may be biased, right? So when we are the person who is experiencing the privilege, for example, someone said housed people, someone said Christian folks, we may not be aware that we are a privileged group. And so when we are able to go about our lives and love and marry the people that we want to marry and love, we may not recognize that we have privilege when there are other folks who are unable to do that, right? So again, this whole part of the conversation, again, is about raising our awareness and hearing from other folks who may be in our out groups, right? When we're in the out group, sometimes it's easy for us to recognize privilege that people who are privileged do not recognize that they have. And when we're talking about things like whiteness and our proximity to whiteness, again, we may not recognize our own privilege. Even though we may be a marginalized group, we still have privilege in some instances. So again, this part of the conversation, someone said something about age. I want to make sure to lift that up because as an aging society, we have to recognize that like privilege in the age category can work in opposition in both directions, right? So if you're the young person on the younger end of the spectrum, then you obviously in some cases might perceive older people to have privilege. However, there are places and times where that paradigm shifts and then the younger person becomes the person who is more privileged and the older person now suddenly has less privilege and less visibility. So again, remember we said earlier, we all experience this at different times and places, and it can be positive or negative, because I'm sure it's a positive thing when you're in the privileged category. Yes, people who are employed. I mean, you guys have some awesome answers. Move to the next slide. So types of privilege that you might have. We talked about a lot of these previously: race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender and gender identity, financial situation, able-bodied, religion, citizenship, education. I think we covered every single area and more here in our previous dialogue. Next slide. And biases to consider. So gender bias could be physical characteristics. Anybody know anything about fat shaming? Anybody know anything about shaming people who are not muscular or have certain body types or have certain types of physique? Racial bias, so there's lots and lots and lots of bias around race. Someone mentioned the police, law enforcement, so there can be fear of law enforcement. Higher burdens of proof. These are things where we're seeing folks of color having to provide, all of this evidence that they are who they say they are, or that they are in the right places, having to prove that they have a right to be there. I know for myself, an example of that is simply flying first class. I can't tell you the number of times I have had gate agents to point me to the other line to say, this is for first class, folks who are flying first class. And I'm like, yes, I know. I'm supposed to be right here. But they then still want to see my ticket, and they have to get on their computer and check and do all these different things simply for me to prove that I have a right to be standing in the line of the first class area. And I know that you all have other examples of things where you may have to, have higher burdens of proof. Bias faced by folks who have, there's cultural bias for folks who identify as immigrants, language bias, putting everything in English, not wanting to provide translation services like disabilities, geographic things. I'm a person who is from the South. I live in Memphis, Tennessee. And again, I can't tell you the number of times where my intellect has been questioned by people who are from other parts of the world. And I'm just like, I have a whole doctorate. I've been in school the majority of my life, but I still get questions about my credentials and things like that, simply because people have this bias towards Southerners. And stereotypes. We all know about stereotypes, but in case you don't know, these are things that we think about certain people without any evidence, right? If we have seen things in the media, there are images that have been shown to us, and we connotate meaning with those images. And we think that's how people who may fit that description, that's how they're portrayed, so that's who they are. Couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth, but that's what we believe about people. Next slide. So let's get back to the basics. What are ways in which we can combat some of this unconscious bias? And we're going to get into a little bit more around doing this in the workplace, but it's important for us to recognize that we have to start with ourselves, right? We can think that it's us versus them. Like, well, other people need to do that. I'm a good worker. But we have to start with ourselves. So we can do this by practicing active listening, stepping into situations free of judgment and free of preconception. Receive people as they come to you, because not every person's the same. Believe your clients or your patients or your participants when they tell you they're experiencing pain or they're experiencing some type of ailment. Believe them. And doubt yourself. Another thing that's important. Don't always assume that you're right, or that you know the answer. Be willing to doubt yourself, to question, inquire, and be mindful of the ways in which unconscious bias shows up for you, so that you are even more mindful when you encounter other people. Next slide. Diversity, equality, inclusion. These are three words that I would challenge us to review and revisit every single day. Diversity. Everyone is individual and different. Equality. Everyone deserves equal access to opportunities, regardless of what type of opportunity it is. If you are not ensuring that people have a level playing field to be able to access the opportunity, then you're not practicing equality. Diversity, everyone is different. I want to go back to diversity because I do think that we have to guard against this box checking mentality. Oh, well, we have a Black person, and we have a white person, and we have a woman, and we have a man. We're diverse. Diversity can mean so many other things that go beyond racial diversity. And so I challenge, again, challenging. I challenge us to think outside of those binary walls. What is true diversity? What does it mean to invite people from the out group to be a part of the work that we're doing, to access the opportunities that we have available in our communities? And inclusion, a sense of belonging, making sure that people feel valued, respected, that we're asking them how they would like to engage with us, and not assuming that we know the best way in which to get things done. People like to be engaged in different ways. Even though we are in the middle of this global pandemic, I can assure you, not everybody enjoys being on Zoom, So ask people how they want to be engaged. Ask people what are ways in which we can be supportive to them, ways that we can show our commitment, things like that help people to feel a part of the in group. Next slide. So in the workplace, again, we talked quickly about inclusion, equity, and diversity, And so we have to begin by creating an inclusive culture within our organizations and places of work. Inclusion, ask people if they feel included. Ask people, do they feel like they belong? We can simply ask our staff members questions and they'll tell us how they feel. Quickly in the chat, if you are a part of a workplace or a group who has done some type of survey or done some type of workplace environmental questionnaire with you about how you feel within your place of work, if you could just do a thumbs up or a check or a star in the chat. And I'm not seeing a lot of stars, which tells me, Some people are doing it. Yeah, some people are doing it. Diversity. Ask people, who is missing from this conversation? Thank you all for being here. Who's missing? Because we always want to acknowledge folks who are at the table, but we should never assume. We should always question, doubt ourselves. Don't assume that we have everybody in the conversation that needs to be in the conversation. And ask the people who are at the table, who's not here that should be here? And then after we ask who's missing, ask, what do y'all think is keeping folks from being here? Is it us? Is it our failure to invite? Is it our failure to reach out to folks? Do we have the right relationships? And if we don't, how do we make those relationships? What steps do we need to take to make those relationships? I'll give you an example of work that we do within the Harm Reduction Coalition. One of our staple values is meaningful inclusion of people who use drugs. We want people who use drugs to be a part of our work at every level. And so we have to consciously create those opportunities. And then we have core groups of people who have been a part of our work for a number of years. Then we have to ask ourselves, how do we create relationships with new people so that we're continuing to have new voices in the conversation, so that we're continuing to grow and evolve as an organization while we honor the value of having meaningful inclusion of people who use drugs. What does that really mean? Does it mean the same thing 10 years ago that it means today? Will it mean the same thing 10 years from now? What is meaningful inclusion defined as? What are examples of that? And then asking people who use drugs to help us with those definitions and those nuances. And so it's all about, you know, recognizing that we don't have all of the answers, and we always have to continue to ask more questions, make sure that we are partnering with people who are not the usual suspects, right? That's where we fall short. When we stay in our in group, people who we know, we know we can call Susie. Susie always calls. Susie's always there for us whenever we call on them. But maybe we should say to Susie sometimes, Susie, we know we've had this relationship with you for a long time. Are there other people that we need to include? Who in your circle needs to be a part of this? And in terms of retention, again, continuing to ask those questions about, you know, what do people need to stay engaged? That is all about, you know, creating a personal ecology with folks. What needs to exist in your world for you to stay engaged with our process or with our organization? You know, do we need to have more professional development? Do you need self-care time? Are your opinions being valued? Are we taking your suggestions? Are we taking your feedback? Feedback is so important, making sure that folks within your workplace are able to have a place that is not judge-free, a place that is you know, free of barriers, where they can provide feedback, direct feedback about what's working and what's not working, because we all can always benefit from feedback. Next slide. Some folks think they've already learned this, someone said in the chat box. That's right. But the thing about learning is it's an ongoing process. Learning, anything that's not learning is not growing. Anything that's not, my grandmother used to say, anything that's not growing is dead. So when we're not learning, when we're not asking these questions, we're not challenging ourselves. You know, what is our mission doing? Our mission isn't thriving. Our goals and objectives aren't thriving. We're not living. You're right. We're existing, but not necessarily living. So we want to be at the center of change. We want to be an agent of change. And these are some of the characteristics of what it means to be an agent of change. You want to be a person that's proactive and not reactive. Now I recognize that there are moments where something can come out of the blue, like a global pandemic that no one expected. And you have to react, you have to respond. Like none of us knew back in March that we would experience this. And so we have to be reactive. We couldn't have planned ahead because we just simply didn't know. But for the most part, we know what our programs, we know what our goals are, what we're trying to accomplish in the world, how we're trying to provide our healthcare services, how we're trying to engage with our patients and clients. We know that up front. How are we going to be proactive about making sure that we're able to do that? And so we have some other characteristics here that I just want you to take a quick look at what stands out to you about ways that you can be an agent of change within your organization. Next slide. Interventions that you can take. De-biasing, right? So de-biasing, again, is about raising that awareness, about making sure that you are aware how your own biases play a role and being able to recognize when someone else may be operating from a biased place, preventing implicit bias from affecting your behavior. So you can, it's one thing to recognize it. The second step is to do something about it. And then having other ideas and visions forward for how you want your work to look that guards against implicit bias. Next slide. Retraining your mind. These are steps and examples and ways that you can de-bias, reprogram yourself, right? Replace those stereotypes. Increase opportunities to be in contact and engage with other community members. Be intentional about the things you do. Don't make these assumptions. Use flashlights to expose biases, right? You have to have conversations. That's that feedback loop within your organizations and within yourself. Question yourself and commit to an action plan. I want to step back to number 7. Let's just be clear that one size does not fit all, right? So what my organization can do is totally different from what another organization do. You should customize your debiasing tactics. Next slide. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you will share your questions in the chat box. And the last slide will show you how to contact me if you would like to talk later.
Dr. Bowers, thank you so much. I think if we were actually seeing you live at our conference room, you would be having a standing ovation. So I'll just give one to you right now. So we have some questions that were sent to me by private chat. So if you can show your video and unmute yourself, Dr. Bowers, we'll address some of those questions. The first question I have is from a participant in Florida, and she's asking, how can I be an ally that is trusted by, and I put it in quotes, the other?
I think going back to one of the slides, that there's a tactic in there on creating relationships that are intentional. In my experience, and I am an ally, a big ally in Memphis to the transgender community, who has a lot of fear of other community members, specifically cisgender women. The way to do that is to, one, show up in those conversations and spaces, recognizing the privilege of being able to be there. Secondly, don't ask for anything. Show up asking how you can serve. And lastly, be intentional. No transactions. People they're exhausted. Someone said earlier, I'm exhausted. People are exhausted with entities, organizations, individuals coming into the community wanting things, whether it be, oh, I was just want to hear about your experience. And, you know, tokenizing people's lived experience is a way in which we kind of kill the opportunity to build trust with people. But be genuinely yourself. Step in. I want to learn. I want to know more. I don't know anything about the community. I want to learn. I want to learn from you. I want to be there to serve how I can alongside you. And don't ask for stuff all the time. I think that is, you know, you have to show yourself trustworthy in order for people to trust you. And that is, you know, just some simple ways in which you can be an ally in communities where you may be the privileged party, is use your platform to advance their goals.
Excellent, thank you. I have another question here from someone joining us from San Diego. Dr. Bowers, you mentioned the checkbox. If we're trying to be inclusive and diverse, what's the harm of using the checkbox?
I think the problem with the checkbox is it's literally a box, right? So you have all these boundaries that don't allow you to get outside of certain areas. So what I mean by not using the checkbox is it's okay to tick off demographics, but what other things are we defining as diversity? What types of lived experience does an individual bring? Is everything tied to, you have to check off that you have a high school diploma or you have a college degree? What types of lived experience qualifies a person for that same position and makes them competitive, or even in some cases more qualified than somebody who has a degree? You know, valuing hiring the right person or bringing in the right person over, well, we have to have somebody white or we have to have a man. Being willing to push back and say, you know, yes, we know we're committed to having a certain, you know, parity and inclusion of certain representation, but also leaving ourselves space on the table to honor other types of diversity is what I mean by avoiding just checking off.
Mm, thank you. Another question. In your years of experience doing HIV work, what examples of implicit bias have you seen that's impacted patient care?
Oftentimes, I see providers who make the assumption that they don't honor patient fatigue, right? We know that although we've had great advancements in HIV treatment, people can become fatigued because this is for their whole life, right? They don't have breaks. They have to take the medicine every single day. And sometimes medicines have side effects that can fatigue a person. And so we have to find ways in which we are not, just assuming that, oh, well, Sally just is being non-compliant because she just does not care about her health, or she just does not want to do what I'm telling her to do as her provider. Recognizing that people are whole people, and sometimes, we have that cognitive dissonance where we know that I know I need to take this medication, but the side effects make me sick and I'm just tired. Or I'm just tired of hearing about my HIV status. And being able to work with people through those rough moments where we can continue to highlight to them the importance of their adherence to their medication and treatment plans, but also helping them figure out strategies that reduce harm to them so that they are willing to adhere and be compliant. I've seen people assume that because someone didn't show up for their appointments, it was because they were irresponsible. And that in our community, bus routes had been cut, and so people had limited access to transportation to their appointments, and they were late all the time because maybe the medical van didn't show up on time because they are stretched to their capacity. Like, there are all these reasons why this one client is always late, but it's not because that person is irresponsible or doesn't care about their health. They have other life circumstances that prevent them from being on time. And my advice to that person when we were doing this monitoring visit was, okay, let's have a conversation with the person about what's going on in their life that's causing this. And maybe we can figure out some other resources that we can refer them to so that they can make it on time. We know that you have limited time to see people. So we want to make sure that we're working with them, so we're attacking the issue from both ends and not just making an assumption about them not caring about their health.
Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Bowers. I have another question. This one's coming from Las Vegas. Do you think having access to PrEP as prevention has created a cultural divide between young gay men and men who have survived living with HIV and AIDS for years? Cultural divide.
I definitely think there's some privilege there. I think, that there are some folks who, there's so many things that I could say about that question. I think, there is some privilege at play there. There are some folks who, feel like, well, I've gone this long and what I do works. And I think that, as I said before, there's not a one size fit all attitude. My direct answer to that question is, I think there could be some division within those communities. I think a way around that is, having some conversations that bring those communities together to talk about strategies, because every PrEP is not a magic pill for every single person. Like, it's not the silver bullet in everybody's life. I do not presume to know why someone would not choose sex PrEP. They may have other things going on that prevent them. I know in my state, it's very expensive, even though we have some PrEP clinics that are free. For some people, at one point, we didn't even have enough doctors to even write prescriptions for PrEP. And in some other cases, it was the cost. They would write the prescription, but it was too expensive. So again, I don't know what people's lived experiences are that cause them not to use that resource. Vice versa, I don't know what accesses people have. So I think that, like, helping folks to break down that device barrier is opening up a conversation with folks to try to understand people's feelings around it, You know, and not even assuming that all the young people feel a certain way and all the older people feel a certain way. Because I think there can be some intersection there as well that is worth exploring.
Excellent. The next question is, can you provide some tips of how to get people to understand their privilege and recognize it?
I think that the exercise that we did here on this activity, on this conversation, is a great way. Number one, you know, having people to realize when they're talking about us and when they're talking about, when I'm talking about me and when I'm talking about them, or us versus them, is a great way for us to recognize how easy it is to point out other people's privilege. But I think in doing, we have to be willing to have conversations with other people who are different from us, who can help us recognize our privilege. You have to have that diversity and that inclusion there when you're having the conversation, so that, as I said, when we were doing this today, I'm sure that there are people on this call or in other places or who will hear this, those folks and say, well, I'm a member of that group and I don't have privilege, or you know, vice versa. So just being willing to discuss privilege and talk to people who don't have the same demographics as yourself. That's a key. It's about diversifying and out intentionally to people who are very different, who have different lived experiences, to help you recognize your own privilege, if that makes sense.
Very good. Those are all the questions I have, Dr. Bowers. If there are additional questions that you have during the course of today's webinar, go ahead and put them in the chat box or send them to me privately, as we've been seeing, and we could address them at the end. We'll have more time. Dr. Bowers has been wonderful, and I'm going to ask if you can mute yourself and kill that video as we're going into a transition. As we're going into a transition to introduce Dr. Organista, I would be really interested in having the participants now address the following question. What word comes to mind for you if we could have a world free of bias? What would that world look like? So go ahead and use one word to describe what would that world look like, and put it in the chat box as we transition into Dr. Organista's presentation. I see words of unity, there's peace, a world that lives harmoniously, love, peace, a world of possibilities. These are all excellent words and concepts, and let us hope that we can get to a point where we can easily make that a possibility. So now we're going to transition to introduce Dr. Kurt Organista. It's a privilege having him here with us today. Privilege in a good way, privilege in a good way. And Dr. Organista, if you could be so kind as to unmute your audio and show us the video of yourself as I introduce you. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Organista probably about 19 years ago, and I heard him speak and I was so impressed by what he had to offer. And Dr. Organista is a professor at the School of Social Welfare, the University of California, Berkeley, where his focus is on Latino psychosocial and health problems. He teaches courses on stress and coping, psychopathology, race, ethnic relations, and social work practice with Latino populations. He conducts research in the area of HIV prevention with Latino migrant laborers, and is the editor of HIV Prevention with Latinos, Theory, Research, and Practice. This was published by Oxford University Press. We have a lot to share about Dr. Organista, and as a reminder, if you want to get a link to today's webinar, please share your email with Lucas, who has been sending little private messages to remind you all. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the private chat for everyone to see, or you can send me your questions through the private chat to me directly. But now I have the privilege and the honor of having Dr. Organista take center stage. And Dr. Organista, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Carlos. My computer does say that I think you, as the host, need to start my video. Okay, let's see if this works. Oh, I think that's working. Great. Good morning, everybody. At least it's morning here on the West Coast in the Bay Area. I want to start by thanking Dr. Bowers for that important presentation on implicit bias. I will be talking probably a little bit more about explicit bias, as you'll see. So I hope you get a little bit of balance there. I also want to thank Carlos Velasquez for inviting me. It's true that we met quite a while back. We were in some kind of HIV prevention, AIDS treatment conference, focusing on folks that are over-affected by this ongoing pandemic. You know, we forget that this is also a global pandemic for which there's no vaccine, and we need to keep working hard on this. I also want to thank Lori Osorio for helping so much to get my slides ADA compliant, because we want as many people to participate as possible. By coincidence, or maybe not, I got an email from the Department of Health and Human Services yesterday saying that today is National Latino HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. So I guess it's a perfect time to share some of my research. And I noticed in that email that they said that in 2018, that of the 36,400 new cases of HIV, that 28% of those were amongst Latino populations. That's very, very concerning when you think that Latinos make up about 16% of the population. So we got lots to do, and hopefully some of what I'll be sharing today is in the service of that continued challenge. So you can see my learning objectives there on the left side, and you can kind of look over them. I can certainly read over them, but I want you to notice that these learning objectives they're a little bit different than the usual learning objectives, because I'm really hoping that by the end of this talk today, and through our Q&A, because I see all kinds of great questions coming across the chat, that you guys will be able to conceptualize sexual risk from a structural vulnerability framework. In other words, it's not just individual level risk, which we always seem to learn about and focus on, but sometimes there are structural environmental factors that create a context for risk, which pushes some people more into risk than others. Similarly, on my second bullet point there, I want you guys to be able to identify not individual risks, because we know a lot about that, and of course we want to continue working on that, but I want you to be able to identify structural environmental risk and structural environmental protective factors. And in this case, I'm going to be talking about Latino migrant day laborers, that they're going to be the sort of case study in structural vulnerability. But all of you, you may work with different populations, and I want you to think of the groups you work with as the case study in structural vulnerability. And then finally, I'd like to describe, and I hope you can be able to describe by the end of this talk, some structural prevention interventions and how those can mitigate some of the health disparities that we see out there. So those are my objectives, and I'm going to try to control my slides to see if it works, Carlos. If not, I'll ask you to forward them. Yep, it seems to be working, although I lost my image. Is that a problem? If it's not a problem, I'll just keep talking. Will that work, Carlos? Can you guys see me okay?
You see everything. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So this was a book that I put out back in 2012 because not only did I meet Carlos Velasquez, but I think I met so many people across the country that were very, very concerned about Latinx populations and all the subpopulations that are at risk for HIV/AIDS. And so I sort of corralled them all, and I said, we need to put a book out on HIV prevention with Latinos that focuses on theory, research, and practice. And then I went to Oxford University, and I really pushed them on the cover of this title of this book here. They say you can't judge a book by its cover, but I said, listen, you got to put some folks on this cover. We need to see La Familia there on that cover because they are at risk. We need to see some Latinx educators, and we need to see some sexual minority folks, particularly men, sexual minority men who are at the highest risk for HIV/AIDS. That number I was giving you about national from the DHHS, the 28% of the new cases in 2018, 78% of those cases, almost 80% of those cases were among sexual minority men who have sex with men. So that I definitely wanted that on the cover of this book. And so what I'm talking about today, there were a bunch of ideas that came about when this book was coming out about structural vulnerability. And I've had a nice, rich opportunity to research this out in the community. And that's what I'll be sharing with you today. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be focusing on Latino migrant day laborers. And as you see in this slide, these are folks who come from Central America, that come from Mexico mainly. These are virtually all undocumented people, low socioeconomic status. These are people who come desperate, really, to find work, to support their families back home. And you probably have seen these folks out on busy street corners or in front of paint shops or in front of hardware stores, really just waiting to be picked up for a day's work. Very often in construction, and painting homes and things like that, but really any odd jobs, moving, landscaping, you name it. So this study that I'll be talking about, it was a 5-year study. It was funded by NIAAA. And we had kind of a theoretical model that we were trying to flesh out, but we began by doing, as you see in the slide, 51 in-depth interviews. So we really got out on the streets of San Francisco and in Berkeley, and we really tried to work through our community partners who serve day laborers so that we had the trust in place. And we interviewed people. We really asked them about their lives. We really tried to back up and say, let us try to understand the lives of these folks in their own voices so that we can come up with a structural vulnerability model of risk. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share some of the quotes that were salient, that in people sharing their experience with us, so that we could better think about a structural vulnerability model of risk for HIV/AIDS. So this man, Augustine, if you all can read that quote, which says, "My goal is to have a family, a lady, 2 children, and a little home, and a job where you can work 5 days a week, to have love with your partner." You know, he shares with us something that I would call a pretty common, you know, a fairly universal dream, you know, of having a meaningful relationship and family and work. It's a pretty modest dream, and this gives us some insight into why these folks would take all these risks and chances by coming over and doing day labor work, which, as you can probably guess, is not necessarily the best paying, and there's all kinds of vulnerabilities in day labor work. But let's listen to the voices of these men. Next slide, please. This guy, whom we will call Juanito, he gives us a quote here that's very interesting. He says, "I miss my family, but I must work in the United States to support them." This is a contradiction. So he is living day to day with this contradiction. Next slide, please. This man says, "I have not seen my wife and children for 10 years. I've not worked in many days. I've not sent them any money." Can you all imagine what that would be like, you know, to not see your partner, your children, if you have children, for 10 years? And you can't even quite justify that because you haven't even been able to find work. You can't even send them money, which is the whole purpose of your being here as a migrant worker. Next slide. This man, who we'll call Lázaro, he uses a very interesting term here that I think a lot of Latino folks might recognize. He says, "My desperation is that I have to stay in the US longer to make money, but if I stay too long, I'm going to lose my family." So he's thinking about this weird kind of, you know, this feeling of desperation. And some of you listening to this presentation, you probably have an idea of what that means. I know as a Chicano guy growing up in East LA, I always heard that term, desesperación. And we heard it so often. Anytime we talked to these day laborers and interviewed them, they would use this term so often that we decided that we needed to create a scale of desesperación for day laborers, and that would be part of the model that we were building. So we go to the next slide. We actually wrote up this scale, you know, and it might be a little bit hard to read, but over on the right side we had something like 11 or 12 questions, and you know, we said, you know, how often do you feel overwhelmed by obstacles, you know, in your path? You know, how often do you get angry because you're not making the money that you need, you know? And if this business of validating a scale, you know, you have to, you know, create these items, and then you have to administer it to a large sample, which we did, about 350 day laborers. And then you do this factor analysis where you want to see, you know, do all these items sort of hang together? So you intercorrelate them. And when we did that, this scale broke down to 2 clusters. One that we called frustration, meaning that these men often felt frustrated about not reaching the goals that they had set for themselves. And then just dissatisfaction, you know, dissatisfaction with how things were going in the US. And I want to share this one quote because this was a quote, one of many quotes that we collected about desesperación, and it just seemed to capture so much. So this person says, "En la desesperación puede ser que se siente uno solo, deprimido y triste, y lleva el momento en que uno caiga." Translation: in a state of desperation, one can feel alone, depressed, and sad, and therein lies the moment when one falls. And I would ask them, falls? And they would say, sí, caerse en los vicios, fall into the vices like drinking or drug use or, unprotected sex and things like that. So this ended up being something that we learned by talking to these men. Next slide. Here's a story we heard very often. I told my girlfriend I was going to the US for 1 to 2 years to make money for us. I told her to wait for me. I'm wondering if anybody out there listening knows how this story ends. Next slide, please. But after 2 years, she left me for another man. And this is a man that we'll call Luis. He's been in the US 6 years now, and he's still very upset about this. Next slide. Drinking ruins your health, your family, your work. No one gives you a job anymore. This is a quote by somebody we'll call Alejandro, who was just stuck in this excessive drinking of alcohol, like too many of these folks. Next one. Two months ago, I had unprotected sex, no condoms. I was drinking with friends from Mexico. We got drunk. We decided to go looking for a girl. Next slide. And we found a girl on the street. We talked to her, got her into the car, and yes, we gave her money. We did not have condoms, no protection. So let me pause here just for a second, and let me ask the audience out there. Listening to these voices of the men, that we took time, we spent about 1.5 years out there getting to know people, build trust, and listening to these voices, does this begin to help you all understand the day labor experience, the context of their lives that might push people over the line into risk? So I'm seeing some really cool chats here. This resonates so deeply. It's hard to hear, Carlos says. I'm gonna speak up. So I'm really hoping that looking at these quotes, I hope they're as helpful. To say, yes, thank you for sharing these quotes. They're very powerful. Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that. We learned so much just by talking to people, kind of like Dr. Bowers was saying, we kind of backed up and tried not to presume that we knew so much, but we wanted to kind of take the lead and really talk to people, understand, well, what's great about day labor, what's not great, So yes, as somebody says here, these are essential voices. So thank you for that validation. Appreciate it. So it's with this kind of information and our read of the literature, and I had a great Latino team of researchers who had done quite a lot of years working with day laborers that we would sit down and come up with a model. So let's look at the next slide real quickly. I don't have to tell you all that there are multiple levels of vulnerability that are related to problem drinking and sexual risk-taking. You can see down here, of course, HIV/AIDS involves biomedical factors, and there are biomedical solutions, right, like PrEP for that. Of course, it involves behavioral factors, and we've spent decades, focusing on risk behaviors. But these risk behaviors, they happen in situations. And I was trying to give you guys a little flavor of some of the situations that day laborers run into day after day after day. And those are situations that I would say are produced and reproduced by structural environmental factors, larger social, environmental, contextual factors that produce this population of migrant workers in our country. Next slide. Just to give you kind of a flavor, of, yeah, you can click that and fill the slide, Carlos. There you go, stop there. Just to give you a flavor of what I mean by structural factors, and maybe these are even superstructural factors, but you know, we have something called NAFTA, which is a free trade agreement between the US and Mexico that started in 1994. And that was supposed to, you know, earn us a lot of money, and Mexico was supposed to earn a lot of money, and they told us that migration from Mexico was going to stop because Mexico was going to get so rich through this free trade agreement. Well, guess what? That hasn't happened. Mexico hasn't made, there are some people in Mexico, there are some businesses and corporations that have made money, but for the most part, it's kind of a flat line if you look at the gross national product of Mexico since 1994 when NAFTA was passed. And just to give you an idea of how this relates to undocumented migration, you know, small farmers in Mexico, once NAFTA started, they went out of business because, for example, it became cheaper to buy corn from the US than to grow corn in Mexico. I don't know if you can wrap your mind around that, but corn in Mexico that's like the basis for all the great Mexican food, right? Enchiladas, tamales, and pozole. I mean, what doesn't have corn in it? You know, corn, it's the indigenous crop from Mesoamerica, you know. But small farmers couldn't grow it because you could buy it cheaper from the U.S. because the U.S. subsidizes corn. You know, if you're a U.S. corn farmer, it only costs you 50% of what it normally costs to grow corn. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this is because since 1994, over 2 million people in agriculture in Mexico have lost their work. They just can't compete. And so guess where they go? They come to the U.S., you know, to work in the service sector, and we certainly hire them. Undocumented people make up 5% of the entire workforce in America, about 10% of places like in California. And it's related to how we do international trade because free trade is not necessarily fair trade. And if that wasn't enough, then we started the Central American Free Trade Agreement in 2005, and so similar things are happening there. And we all know that the immigration system is broken because when those folks come to seek work that they need in the US, and we do have the work for them, but we don't make work authorization very available. So people have to come undocumented, and then of course they're subject to many, many kinds of vulnerability. I'm not going to say more about that because you can imagine we can talk about it, but I just want to point out some of the structural factors that really, you might say, create an undocumented labor population in the US, and in this case, day laborers, the group I'm focusing on. Next slide, please. Give me one more click on that, Carlos. Okay, stop there. Now I'm going to share with you all my model of structural vulnerability, and again, we're using day laborers as the case study. So I want you to look at the left-hand column there in green. These were some of the environmental factors that we really felt were most compelling in terms of sexual risk, and they may not seem so at first blush, but we'll get to that. So there's three things that stood out for us in the lives of day laborers, and I'll start with working condition. These are folks who were chronically underemployed, frequently unemployed. These were people who worked dangerous jobs without protection. These were people who were treated out of money. These were people who were lucky to make $200 a week, which I'm sure you can appreciate is not going to get you too far in the Bay Area. So we measured working conditions. We really took the time to say, tell me about the last week. Did you work much? How much did you make? How often did you wait for work on the street corner? And then if your working conditions aren't good, you can imagine that your living conditions are going to be challenging as well. So we really made it a point to measure the living conditions of these folks, which ranged from sleeping in cars and living under bridges to being overcrowded in an apartment with 5, 6, 7 workers. You can imagine the risk there for COVID-19, right? And then we also measured discrimination, the day-to-day discrimination, how people were treated or mistreated or not served or disrespected. And those seem to be, there's more environmental factors that we could capture in the lives of day laborers, but those seem to be very, very important because we wanted to show the relationship between these environmental factors and these distress-related factors. So we measured problem drinking because we could see that that was a problem. We measured depression and anxiety. And then we used the scale that we created, desesperación, 2 subscales, the frustration subscale and then the dissatisfaction scale, because we figured that these kinds of environmental factors would play out at the individual stress level. Click again, Carlos, please. And this is what we were looking at. This was our outcome variable. We wanted to look at sexual HIV risk, and we wanted to look at alcohol and drug-related sexual HIV risk. So we asked people about their sexual behavior over the last 6 months. Was there alcohol before and during sex? Was there other kinds of drugs before and during sex? Of course, we asked about condom use, frequency of condom use. We also asked about risky partners, as you saw earlier, sex workers being one of those examples. Next click, please. But we also wanted to look at protective factors, you all. We know that in the community and in the culture, there are protective factors, and we wanted to understand those, and we did come to understand them. For example, down here, the men would talk about staying in contact, with their families back in Mexico, back in Central America. They were happiest when they were sending money home, but they also sent gifts home, cards, letters. All the day laborers have a cell phone. That might surprise you, but you really have to have it if you want to, do work on a moment's notice. So just texting people's family, this is something that we identified as a protective factor, and of course we measured it. So all the variables you see on the screen were carefully measured and put into a survey. We also asked people about cultural resources in the community and Latino community services. By cultural resources, I mean, we asked men, if you're from Guatemala, can you find, Guatemalan food or festivity or music? Can you find people from your home country, your paisanos that you can hang out with and be friends with, partners, et cetera, et cetera. And we also asked them about services. Have you used, here in the community, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, have you used any health services, mental health services, AA services for alcohol use? And we also asked them, when you did use them, how were they? And the men told us that they helped us define cultural competence, which I was really happy because that's kind of a controversial term. But they told us that the best services are people who knew how to treat Latinos, people who gave them respect, not just spoke Spanish, which was important, but people who didn't keep them in long waiting lines. So we measured all that. So we measured all those cultural and community resources because we figured even though these environmental factors would lead to sexual risk-taking by way of these distress factors, we figured that maybe there were some community factors that might also protect against this risk factor on the right side. Next click. There you go. So down on the right-hand side there, it's a little small, but this study was called this is a structural environmental model of alcohol and substance-related sexual HIV risk in Latino migrant day laborers. And we did a survey. I don't know if you can see it down there. We did a survey of 344 men. It's a big survey. As I said, we had some grant money. And so we could pay everybody, $40 for their time because they took 90 minutes out of their time to measure, to ask about all these things. And now what I'm gonna show you now is the results of the statistical analysis that we did, and that's called structural equation modeling. Some of you have probably heard of that. All that is a statistical packet that helps you test out your theoretical model. So structural equation model helps us to understand all of the relationships between all of the variables that you're looking at on the screen right now that compose our model. So here are the findings, and I'm going to do these a click at a time. Carlos already did that for me. So the first thing we found here is that discrimination, and it's kind of hard to see, but discrimination was significantly and positively related to desesperación, frustration, desesperación, dissatisfaction, anxiety, and depression. Not problem drinking, but certainly related to a lot of those distress-related risk factors. Next click. Also, living conditions. If living conditions were good, you can see that they're negatively related to desesperación, dissatisfaction. So if they were good, then the desesperación, dissatisfaction was low. But you can imagine that the living conditions tended to be pretty poor. So if they were poor, that would increase this particular feeling of desesperación. Next click. Finally, we found it down here. Of all those distress-related factors, problem drinking, probably won't surprise you, was very significantly, very strongly related to this composite index of sexual risk-taking. But as you can see, it's kind of all alone there. So the question is, how does it fit into the larger model? Next click, please. This was a great finding, you all, that if people stayed in contacts with their family back in Mexico, texting and sending money and, just staying in day-to-day contact, that was significantly and negatively related to every one of these distress-related factors. We were very happy to see that that's a powerful protective factor. Next click. And then the other protective factor, having cultural resources and having culturally competent Latino community resources available, that was negatively related to desesperación and negatively related to depression. So we're very happy to see that there are these cultural and community protective factors that do protect against distress, particularly problem drinking, right? Because we already know that that's related to the sexual risk variable at the end. Next click. We were kind of sad to see that as discrimination went up, that was negatively related to contact with family, that was negatively related to using cultural and community resources. I want you to hold this question in your mind. Why would that be so? If these men are experiencing a lot of discrimination on a daily basis, why would they not be in contact with their families? Why would they not be in contact, with some of their paisanos from their country? Why would they not use some of these services? Somebody's texting in shame and embarrassment, and I'm glad you're theorizing here with me, because I was kind of sad to see this, but I want to know what's going on. Next click, please. Same thing with working conditions. You can see that it's significantly and positively related to contact with family. That's good, except working conditions tend to be very poor. And so if working conditions are very low, then contact with family is also going to be low. Next click. We also found out that living conditions was positively related to going out and partaking of cultural and festivities and even using needed services. But again, unfortunately, living conditions tended to be pretty challenging and pretty, minimal and difficult. So that just simply means if living conditions are low, then the use of these protective factors are also low. Next click, please. I want to kind of emphasize these purple arrows here. Yeah, I like that people are really thinking about this. And give me one more click, Carlos. Great. So I want to emphasize the through line here, okay? So what you see here is when discrimination is high, contact with family is low, and if it's low, problem drinking is high, and if problem drinking is high, then sexual risk taking is high. Same thing for working conditions. If working conditions are low, which they typically are, contact with family is low, but if that's low, drinking is high, and then sexual risk taking is high. So these purple lines here are, I call them the through lines through the model, because basically they say that these environmental factors do result in sexual risk taking, and they do so by not using this protective factor and perhaps coping, with all of these negative environmental conditions by excessive drinking, because this is problem drinking, which then gets connected to sexual HIV risk. There's some good questions coming in about, does machismo pride play a factor in the sense of needing? Yeah, I'm loving everything that's coming through on the chat, because obviously I've had to interpret this, and I definitely want to know how you guys are thinking about this. But let me start wrapping this up so we can do a fuller Q&A, we're right around that time, and I'm actually ready to wrap this up. But I want to show you, based on this model, what would the if this is a structural environment, if this is a model of structural vulnerability, what are the implications for structural environmental prevention interventions? Next slide, please. I think the implications are very straightforward. If day laborers, like a lot of undocumented folks, are facing a tremendous amount of discrimination here in the U.S., and I don't think I need to convince people that that's happening, then they need to fight. We need to fight that kind of discrimination. And this is a picture from the May 1st rally in 2006, when they first wanted to make being undocumented in the country a felony, which it is, by the way. If you cross the border, first time it's a misdemeanor, second time it's a felony. And that's really troublesome, because if you look at a law book and you see what a felony is, it really doesn't relate to simply being in the country unauthorized. So that's one implication. Another one is we need to promote immigration reform. Nobody wants to fix the broken immigration system, even though it has resulted in over 10 million undocumented people here living and working in our vast service sector, for example. If we could make work authorization to these workers that we actually need and depend on, many of whom are essential workers, that would be a win-win situation for the U.S. and for the folks coming from countries where they can't find the work to support their families. We need to support Latino cultural resources. This is what makes us feel human, when we enjoy, comfort food from our culture and music and people from our community. And we also need to support Latino-focused community services that are really actually doing a great job, according to these men, of knowing how to treat Latino people. Next slide. We could give people phone cards to encourage them to call home. We could encourage people to do virtual visits with their family, on their cell phones, particularly when they're experiencing terrible living and working conditions and discrimination. That's when we need our family. We need to remind these men that, familismo, that interpersonal support, that's two-way support. It's not just you, sending money home and taking care of your family. They needed to know what's happening with you so that they can give you support. Here's teaching people vocational English. More English skills helps people to negotiate better work in the U.S. And I also want to mention that, these men really need some healthy outlets. One of my community partners in West Berkeley that serves day laborers organizes these soccer leagues. And so all these folks get a chance these are leagues, they get a chance to play soccer every Friday with soft drinks and food. And they even have a campeoneta, or a championship, at the end with, other leagues of day laborers. And those are very healthy outlets that people really need in this country. Next slide. In conclusion, Carlos, structural environmental interventions are needed to mitigate structural vulnerability to health risks and health disparities. Next click. Because when we think about comprehensive prevention and intervention, it's biomedical, it's behavioral, but it's also situational, and it's also structural, environmental. Next click. As I say here, just to finish off, yes, it's a tall order, it's challenging, but what's that phrase we like to use? Sí se puede. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Organista, for some insightful research. And as I mentioned in my little chat to you, it is hard to hear these stories because they're reminders of what is a reality for many folks. I have lots of questions here, so I'm going to take the first one I see in front of me. Does machismo or pride play a factor in the sense of needing to be strong, endure conditions for their family back home, resulting in not seeking support services?
You know, I really think that is a factor. You know, you think about these men, you know, coming from their countries of origin, you know, probably coming from the male cultural scripts with which many of we Latino folks are familiar, but not just Latinos. You know, machismo it's a Spanish term, but you know, if you look at our president, that's kind of beyond machismo there. But in answer to your question, I think I think the whole male script there is definitely not something that needs to be broken open like a piñata, and we need to talk to these men and say, hey, you know what? Your family needs and wants to know what's going on with you so they can support you. You're not giving them the chance to support you.
Very well. I have another question. This one is from Texas. In your research, Dr. Organista, did you find that some of the day laborers participated in survival sex, so they got paid for money?
We did find that, yeah. You know, on occasion, you know, it was sometimes hard getting to that subject matter with folks, but you know, on occasion, you know, people would say, well, I'll give you one scenario. So one guy was saying that he hadn't worked for weeks, and he was very, very desperate. And I think he went to paint somebody's house, and the person told him, you can make, $30-40 painting, or you can make, $100 for a sexual favor. So sadly, when you think about the vulnerability of these folks, they can be exploited that way, and it does happen. People would recognize cars coming to the corner, or there was even some talk online about, hey, these men are desperate, and for cheap, you can pick them up for sex, and you can imagine that particular scenario being risky, and really goes back to what I'm talking about, their structural vulnerability.
I've heard stories that there's actually an app that's dedicated to men who want to find men who are willing to exchange that favor.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, Carlos, and it's sad, right? It's sad.
Yeah. Next question I have here is from Fresno. In your research, did you find that most of the day laborers were accessing medical services?
They were lucky to be in San Francisco. They were lucky to be in Berkeley, where there's all kinds of nonprofit agencies that do provide any number of services, immigration-related services, yes, health services, mental health services, alcohol use and substance use-related services. And we were pleasantly surprised that, if you build it right, people will come.
Mm. Excellent. Actually, this next question is really quite related to the one I just gave you. Were there any surprises in your research?
That's a great question. Thank you, because it gives me kind of moment to pause here for a second. Couple surprises come to mind. One was the desesperación that I was talking about earlier, that we would ask people, oh, so, tell me about, depresión or ansiedad, right? And they would more often use that term desperation. So, that's the one that we tried to flesh out. And in the article that I published on this material, I actually put it as an appendix. So if you guys look up this article, it's in the appendix. You're welcome to use it. You're welcome to tweak it for your own population. There's one more surprise though. I thought it was pretty cool, since we were working in community and we were working with the Day Labor Center, we were working with Centro Legal de la Raza, who provides immigration service, these kinds of places. It was cool to learn that some of the day laborers, and there was one in particular, wanted to work with us. He wanted to be like an informant of sorts. And he said, look, you're making up these scales. I'm here, ask me. And so we hired this one day laborer. He was awesome. He wanted to do interviews. And we were like, really, you want to do interviews? Okay, well, you got to go through the training, you got to be able to know how to ask these questions. And we were using a computer, questionnaire, computer-based questionnaire. And he was so motivated. He was a wonderful guy, and he really helped us, with a lot of insider's knowledge. And sadly, he lost a thumb in one of his jobs. He was doing some bone. He lost a thumb and ended up in the emergency room with, as you can imagine, no health care, and kind of compromised in his work. But those were a couple surprises that were pleasant. They were good surprises that I think deepened our understanding of structural vulnerability.
This question comes from Atlanta. Are there any women day laborers?
There's virtually none. I mean, if you think about it, this is a very gendered kind of work. I mean, think about what it would mean to stand out on the street corner, right? All day or all night, waiting for work, right? I'm not saying that that's right, but the gendered script within the culture and also what that kind of means to be out there on the street corner, I have not, I encountered none, although occasionally I've heard that maybe there were one or two in some places, but I would say virtually no, but it wouldn't surprise me if it happened.
Very well. This question is actually from Oakland. So you talked about the use of alcohol and drugs. What was the drug of choice outside of alcohol?
That's a great question, because first and foremost, alcohol really was the drug of choice. It really was the substance of choice. These men, after work would, buy a case, and if they lived together, they would go home and drink a case or two, and it's your turn tonight to buy the beer. And, sometimes they were just so bored with little to do or afraid to go out because of immigration, ICE raids and things like that. So that was clearly the drug of choice. When we asked about other drugs, we tried to ask about drugs that, you could imagine would be more related to sex, right? So we weren't asking about heroin because that doesn't really quite pique people's desires for sex, I don't think. But, things like cocaine, like crack cocaine, which is cheap and around. Any kind of stimulants were probably, and really the sort of popular sex-linked drugs that we asked about, even though they were pretty infrequent, those were the ones that came up.
Very well. Another question. This is interesting. So this is coming from Virginia. In relation to your comment about the phone cards, there is a digital divide for some folks. Is it possible that if everyone had access to the internet, that actually might be a structural intervention that would help create a stronger connection to families back home, and therefore might be increasing protective factors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, think about how much we're all depending on communicating remotely, right? And there is a digital divide, although, as I say, somebody was asking about prizes. I remember when at some point in doing my work over the last 10, 15 years, it was interesting to see everybody get cell phones because they need to be on call for any job that might pop up. But also in the day labor centers, in the mission neighborhood health centers, all the places that serve day laborers, they make they provide computer access, and that was something that we were thinking about. Like if we could just get people, as ET would say, phone home, right? But not just phone home, but see your family, see your wife and kids, see your partner, see your parents, see the people that you're supporting. And there's something I think different about seeing people than just texting or communicating. So that is a long answer to the question, which is yes, absolutely, that would be a great intervention.
Excellent. I'm going to ask Dr. Bowers to join us again. If you could unmute yourself and show your video, because we're getting questions that I think the two of you could answer. But also to Dr. Bowers' point, that it is possible that perhaps there are women who are doing these non-traditional jobs, but they just don't see it, or others don't see it as day laborers. And so we might want to think about, what is that?
Yeah, I'm glad that came up again, because where we see the women, it wouldn't surprise you, is we see them cleaning homes. There's a whole network of women that are cleaning the homes of people, middle-class folks who they come in and clean every week. And of course, also in the hotel industries where you see so many of these women. So I think they find their niche, frankly, in different places, although it wouldn't surprise me if some began, doing day labor.
So I have a question for the two of you, Dr. Bowers and Dr. Organista. So what is the role of stigma in relation to that feeling of desperation, and also of being able to challenge some of the biases that exist? And so maybe we could start with you, Dr. Bowers. What's the role of stigma?
Definitely think that stigma plays a part in both of these conversations. I venture to say that, folks who are, participating in these different behaviors, may feel a great deal of shame within themselves. And it is exacerbated by the shaming that we do within societies for folks who are in situations that cause them to have to use these options. I would say that from a harm reductionist standpoint, we have to be realistic about the realities that people find themselves facing. And as we work with them to help them find other solutions, help them find other options that may be better to really work on destigmatizing day labor. Like that's a thing. Day labor is a needed and valid source of income for some folks. And so there is some stigma that is associated with some of these other phenomena that we're discussing that can be problematic for folks who they may not have the same situation as some of the more extreme cases that we've been talking about. And so for me, hearing the stories, it's like, well, so now the whole idea of day labor is now stigmatized. And so people may feel a great deal of shame for having to see that as their way of making money. No different than sex work or any other phrase that we want to use to describe people's labor. You were talking about women who are domestic workers. Black women have been domestic workers forever. it's a great deal of stigma tied to just being categorized in that particular field of work. And right, those are very respectable sources of income. However, we have all these other things that have been tacked on that create shame for people who have to work in those industries. So for me, I feel like part of that is, again, destigmatizing day labor, and then also helping folks to reframe the ways in which they address the challenges that they see as day laborers. We know that there are a lot of barriers to the way we talk about it, and sort of changing some of the narrative and the stories we tell ourselves about people who do day labor, even though we know these realities exist, can help to kind of destigmatize that particular workforce.
Thank you so much. Dr. Organista, for desperation and the role of stigma there.
Oh, I was just loving what Dr. Bowers was saying, because it helps us to, expand our intersectional thinking about labor, right, and gender, but also the way it's become stigmatized and discriminated. And one of the worst parts of that is people will often internalize that stigma. A lot of pretty strong undocumented people propaganda out there, and they know it's out there. And to the degree, that they internalize that, that's got to be an added stressor. And stigma, by the way, we've known for some time that that's a real risk factor in HIV risk. And stigma, I'll also remind us, it's a social phenomenon. It's part of the society we live in. It's a structural factor.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask for a closing statement from each of you in terms of your hopes to have some day where we can say that we are at zero, that we have no new HIV cases, that everyone is been able to access treatment on demand, and that people who need to be on PrEP have access to PrEP. So what are your closing comments? And I'll start with you, Dr. Bowers.
I think that key factor in getting to zero, it has to be for us to continue to examine our personal biases and the way in which we encounter people in the world. I would be remiss not to continue to encourage people to look at things from a harm reduction lens, because harm reduction allows us to really question our own personal biases and gives us room on the table to restore people's humanity, to give them pathways into our society, to be our neighbors, to come out of this place of being the them category to it being a full us category. And it allows us to give people the autonomy to make the choices that they need to make in their lives, free of our bias, right? Free of the stigmatizing language and stigmatizing behaviors that we do. We infringe on people in our day-to-day walk. I think that we truly can get to zero, but we have to not address issues as a single issue. We have to recognize that people are comprehensive, their needs are comprehensive, and there's not a one way to accomplish the things we want to accomplish. We have to be willing to have those conversations together so we can work together from the grass tops to the grassroots to meet folks in the middle where they are.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Bowers. Dr. Organista, any closing thoughts, and how do we get to zero?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. And I'm glad you have this last slide up, because what I'm going to show you here is these are different levels of the problem of HIV risk. You know, PrEP is a biomedical solution to the level. And we've spent a lot of time teaching people about transmission and how to use condoms and how to negotiate sex, and that you should get HIV testing. Those are behavioral solutions to the behavior level. But where are the HIV prevention strategies aimed at the structural environmental level that produces risky situations that people have to encounter day after day after day? These structural environmental contexts produce and reproduce not risky individuals, but risky situations. So where are the structural environmental, the community-wide, the social policies, that are good? Those are what I think would ultimately get us to zeros. But we're putting too much money down here and not enough out here, which is why I did this study to show you that all of these factors, there's a through line that goes through all of these levels of risk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Organista, Dr. Bowers, for being a part of today's webinar. This is the second of a series of 5. For those of you who want to get the link to access the first webinar, go ahead and just send us your information. We'll be more than happy to share that with you. As a reminder, we're asking people to fill out the evaluation. I want to thank the 2 panelists that we had today, but also to thank all the people that have made this possible, all the support that we have from the Santa Clara County Health Department, the Health Trust, the Pacific AIDS Education and Training Center, and all the behind the scenes people who you don't ever see, but they're invisible, but they're always supportive. In many ways, that's who we need to work with, is to work with the people who are often invisible, but that have a voice. And I hope this effort is a way of being able to highlight the need to elevate their voice, empower them, and make a difference when it comes to getting to zero. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you everyone for your participation, and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Take care.